Talk a lot about Russian oligarchy, and that is certainly true. But anybody who thinks that we don't have an oligarchy in this country is surely mistaken. In our country today, we have two people who own more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American population, and the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 92%. Over 700 billionaires in America became nearly $2 trillion richer during the pandemic.
So this clip from Bernie Sanders points out a bias in the media that people very often don't talk about. And that is the fact that the way that the United States talks about other countries is very different from the way the United States talks about itself. This is especially true when you look at mainstream media outlets like the New York Times or the Washington Post. Anytime they're reporting on other countries, somehow rich people become oligarchs. And most glaringly obvious is the way that they cover socialist countries. So for example, right now we recognize the Supreme Court in the United States is fundamentally working against the interests of the average American, especially when it comes to public opinion. The Supreme Court actively pushes against public opinion right now and has done so throughout its entire history. And we can see this with the impending overturn of Roe v. Wade. And as a result of that, a lot of people in the United States have talked about things like court packing, of cycling judges, of fundamentally changing the structure of the Supreme Court to make it more democratic. But when the same exact thing happened in Venezuela, after President Hugo Chavez was elected and he restructured their Supreme Court, the way the media reported on that was as though it was some sort of assault on democracy, when the reality is United States business owners just didn't like the way democracy was going in Venezuela. And the same is true for other countries. Socialist countries around the world, according to the Western media, are not allowed to have prisons, especially prisons that jail people who commit acts of terrorism, for example. Whenever there's separatist movements that commit acts of terrorism in socialist countries, the United States calls them political prisoners and says that they're being put into labor camps. But here's the thing for you. The United States has labor camps. It actually has more people in labor camps than any other country in the world. That is to say, the United States has the largest prison system on the planet, with the highest rate of incarceration out of any country in the world. And yes, the people who are put in prison in the United States are forced to work. Now, to be clear, this isn't to say that forced labor in prisons is a fundamentally good thing. I personally am a prison abolitionist, but ultimately the way the media reports on these things is very, very telling to their biases. They go out of their way to whitewash things that happen in the United States while actively demonizing other countries and trying to paint them as uniquely evil, when the harsh reality is that by any objective metric, the United States is worse than essentially any other country in the world. I mean, think about it. How can the United States call any other country an authoritarian police state when the United States has the most police and the most people in prison? I mean, think about this for a second. The city of Chicago spends more money on their police department than North Korea spends on their entire military. So if we're wondering who the baddies are, I feel like a look at the raw numbers reveals it pretty clearly to be us, that is to say, the US. But the reason why the United States does this is actually fairly clear. The reality is capitalists have already won in the United States, so they don't need to convince you that capitalism is good. They just need you to not be willing to look at any other country and get ideas from them, which is why they go out of their way to paint these socialist countries as being uniquely evil. You don't need to support American capitalism. All you need to do is reject any ideas that come from socialists in China, Vietnam, or Cuba. And the way they enforce this is by doing things like what they did to Bernie Sanders back when he mentioned the education and healthcare systems in Cuba. I mean, just try it today. Point out the fact that China has more high-speed rail than any other country in the world and has developed an immense high-speed rail network over the span of just a little over a decade. Ask why the United States can't do exactly the same thing, and you will get somebody responding to you saying China's this uniquely evil authoritarian police state. No, mind the fact that they have far less people in prison than we do, with a much lower crime rate, I might add. And don't ask why their crime rate is so low. It couldn't possibly have anything to do with the programs they put in place to make sure that everybody has housing, or that everybody has health care, or that everybody has food on their table. And that's not to say that everybody in China is living a life of luxury, but at least they know that the government is doing what it can to provide for them in certain ways. But whenever we suggest this, whenever we point the success stories of socialist countries out in the world, we get the fear-mongering about oligarchs and corruption and government bureaucrats taking away people's rights. Well, I hate to break it to you, all of those things not only exist in the United States, but are far worse. Especially when you consider the fact that super PACs are still allowed to put out campaign ads. Corruption basically is the system that we have.